I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we're under the impression that some of the elected members came here to the Council with just one priority: to be the mouthpiece for the Party of War's line, to accuse Russia of all ills, completely ignoring the causal links which are the reason for the particularly deep crisis of European security. They believe that they're blameless. Our supercilious ex-partners never noticed, nor do they now see, the plank in their own eye. They are suffering from political colorblindness. They see everything as being black or white. The Russian army conducted one massive and 4 grouped strikes between the 3rd and 9th of January. As a result, we struck transport, air, port, and energy infrastructure, which sustained the work of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, as well as Ukrainian armed forces, UAF temporary deployment sites, and those of foreign mercenaries. This was in response to an attack waged by the Kiev regime on the residency of the Russian president and civilian infrastructure objects in Russia. During the strike, the Oreshnik system was used, a system against which there is no air defense. Our Western colleagues tell us about civilian casualties, the majority of which, as everyone knows, including the Ukrainians, which are the consequences of the work of Ukrainian air defenses. All of these loud but utterly groundless assertions about targeted Russian attacks on Ukrainian families soundly asleep in their homes are utterly uncorroborated. They're not backed up by any facts nor any evidence. The Russian armed forces do not strike civilians. At the same time, our Western colleagues are completely ignoring the crimes being committed by the Kiev regime, which is deliberately striking at Russian regions, striking at civilian objects and civilians. In December 2025 alone, the number of civilians injured by UAF strikes, these are civilians, the figure stood at least 367 people. 56 people died. Against this backdrop, we are to this day astounded by the silent response on the part of the international community, first and foremost the Secretary General of the UN. It's now the norm. Avoiding clearly qualifying such actions as terrorist acts, writing these off as uncorroborated facts, is tantamount to jettisoning the basic principles of international humanitarian law, including the protection of civilians and a ban on premeditated strikes on civilian objects. Yet as soon as Russia uses its military against the Ukrainian armed forces and its infrastructure, emotions start to run high. There are equivocal comments made by the SG and his press secretary. This selective blindness, unfortunately, is characteristic of the UN Secretariat's leadership. In the absence of a response from the so-called collective West, much like the fact that leading Western media sources are completely ignoring these tragedies, is now the lamentable norm. This equates to, de facto, covering for the terrorist acts committed by the Kiev regime and complicity therein. After all, responsibility for what's happening falls not only on those who are pulling the trigger, but also on those who for years have been promoting impunity, supplying arms, and providing political cover for such actions. That's what the billions Ukraine has pested out of the pockets of European taxpayers is going towards. This complicity, this aiding and abetting, sooner or later you'll have to take responsibility for this. We've repeatedly said that not a single action taken by the neo-Nazi posse, which is hunkered down in Kiev, will go unanswered. An utterly flagrant case is yet another despicable terrorist act committed against civilians in the village of Holy, a resort in the Kherson region. Civilians, families with children, locals and visitors gathered at a hotel cafe to celebrate the new year, 2026. At that very moment, Ukrainian terrorists conducted a premeditated strike on this gathering. As a result of the terrorist attack, 29 people perished, including 2 children. Over 30 people were wounded. We don't have the slightest doubt about this odious attack being planned in advance. It was premeditated. Before the strike, a reconnaissance UAV loitered over this settlement for a long time. This serves as further confirmation about the fact that Ukrainians knew full well where it was striking and at whom it was striking. The attack was conducted as clocks struck midnight, right when there were civilians in the building. For those who don't know this, the village of Holy is located in a resort zone on the Gorky Kut Peninsula, surrounded on three sides by the Black Sea. It lies beyond the so-called Red Line. There are no, nor have there ever been any military objects there. The former port long ago lost any significance, and the area is being developed solely for leisure purposes. There are children's camps, recreation centers, and other tourist infrastructure there. Now, this vile terrorist act stands out for its cynicism. While the media, controlled by the office of the Ukrainian president, broadcast the Kiev president's New Year's address, the address by the overseer head of the Kiev regime, containing fallacious calls for peace, the UAF fighters at that very moment deliberately annihilated civilians. Colleagues, we're no longer surprised by the narratives we hear in this chamber. Narratives from those who use their beloved double standards to request Security Council meetings on Ukraine and at the same time hypocritically turned a blind eye to ruthless killings committed on the orders of the Zelensky regime, mired in terrorism, corruption and lawlessness. Zelensky, who's determined to get as much money and weapons from its European puppeteers, both for himself and his inner circle. This terrorist act is not an exception. It's one of the many examples of inhumane crimes committed by the Zelensky regime against Russian civilians. Ms. DeCarlo mentioned them, at least. But as always, the UN cannot verify these. 500,000 people in the Belgorod region are without electricity, but the UN can't verify that for some reason. The Ukrainian posse won't be helped neither by the failed French summit of the Coalition of the Willing, nor by the advance towards Ukrainian borders of NATO forces. The consequences of NATO's presence in the Ukraine is something we've spoken about repeatedly. Although this is something many boasted about only recently, the threat of this was to a large extent the trigger for us starting the special military operation, alongside our desire to end the war waged by the Kiev regime against its own people. Nor will they be helped by incantations about a ceasefire in hope of getting a breather from the devastating defeats Ukraine is experiencing on the battlefield. Nor will Zelensky be helped by his absurd conditions, which don't factor in reality links to which he lost long ago. These are conditions he sets in response to US proposals, thereby nullifying them. All of a sudden, the European Commission is discussing the fact that at some stage, the EU will have to engage in dialogue with Russia. It makes us want to ask, where have you been all this time? We have never turned away from dialogue. It is you who superciliously thought that it won't get that far, it won't go as far as talks because strategic defeat would be inflicted on the Russian Federation. Until the leader in Kiev comes to his senses and agrees to realistic conditions for negotiations, we'll continue solving the problem by military means. He was warned long ago. With each passing day, each day which he squanders, the conditions for negotiations will only get worse for him. Similarly, each vile attack on Russian civilians will elicit a stiff response. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Presidency of Somalia for convening today's meeting, as well as the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, Liberia, and the United Kingdom for their support of Ukraine's emergency request. I'm also grateful to Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Raja Singham from OCHA for bearing witness of new horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity that Russia committed in the last weeks against the civilian population in Ukraine. We praise the leading role of the UN in providing humanitarian aid to those who have suffered. Every time the international community believes that Russia has reached the limits of lies and barbarity, Moscow once again outdoes itself, finding the way to sink even lower and proving that there is no bottom of its criminal intent. Russia deliberately waited until early January, when temperatures in Ukraine plunged to minus 15 degrees Celsius, to unleash some of its most devastating drone and missile strikes against our energy infrastructure, pushing millions of civilians to the very edge of freezing. What we are witnessing these days echoes some of the most infamous precedents in human history, when evil empires sought to break civilian resistance by weaponizing cold, hunger, and darkness. From ancient sieges to medieval winter blockades, history teaches us that deliberately depriving civilians of heat, light, and the means of survival is among the most appalling methods of warfare. The horrific consequence of Russia's brutal attacks was that millions of peaceful Ukrainians, including my family in Kiev, are left for days without electricity, without heating, without water supply, at a time when temperatures at night are approaching minus 20 degrees. This new horrifying wave of terror, also inflicted earlier last week to many other cities across Ukraine, including Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, and Odessa, reflects the determination of Putin to slap in the face of US mediators and continue his barbaric war. The reason why I recall the horrors of the Second World War is not accidental. Ukrainians belong to the biggest victims of Nazism. 80 years ago, that terrible war, which raged on our soil, claimed the lives of up to 10 million Ukrainians. Next month, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will enter its 13th year and the 5th year since the full-scale invasion of 2022. It has now lasted longer than the war between Third Reich and the Soviet Union, 1,418 days. So when we compare World War II to Russia's military invasion now, the parallels are becoming increasingly shocking, not only in the sheer duration of Moscow's brutal war against Ukrainian statehood, but also in the scale of destruction and, tragically, in the mounting toll of human suffering. The level of Russia's systematic crimes we are witnessing day and night has reached an unprecedented height. This Council can no longer ignore this outrageous war. Every single day that the Security Council fails to act to end Russia's war brings more victims. Distinguished colleagues, apart from the barbaric tactics of scorched earth that Russia's troops are employing against the Ukrainian population, there is another reason why Ukraine requested this emergency meeting. During the night of January 9th, Russia not only launched one of the deadliest strikes of missiles and drones against Ukrainian cities, for the second time Russia employed the so-called Oreshnik, an intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile system, against my native region of Lviv, situated just a few dozen kilometers from the EU and NATO border. Since this weapon can carry a nuclear payload, such a blatant attack represents a clear threat to the security of the European continent, undermining regional stability and posing serious risks to broader international peace. Russia has spiraled into a new level of escalation. The fact that Russia now attempts, as we just heard, to justify again this cynical strike by referring to a fake attack on a Putin residence that never occurred is just absurd. But there is nothing new in this approach. Russia began its war of aggression against Ukraine under a fake and fabricated pretext. Russia's claim, which is ridiculous, with Putin's residence is reminiscent of the Gleiwitz incident on 31st of August 1939, when Adolf Hitler staged a false flag attack on a radio station to justify invading Poland. The perfidious logic is identical. The aggressor state fabricates a casus belli where none exists. Let me be clear, this so-called attack on Putin residence is an absolute lie, period. The true purpose of Russia's assault with its alleged Wunderwaffe Oreshnik is brutally clear: intimidation of Ukraine's allies and partner. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and now deputy secretary of the National Security Council, directly confirmed this in his X post, commenting it in a prison-like jargon. I quote, "The ruling European dimwits want a war in Europe after all. It's been said 1,000 times Russia won't accept any European or NATO troops in Ukraine, but no, Macron keeps peddling his pathetic bullshit, Well, come on, this is what you'll get," end quote. And then Medvedev joyfully shared a video of the Oreshnik strike in Lviv region. Putin claims that this high-tech Oreshnik missile cannot be intercepted. This is just a joke. The so-called super weapon he boasts about is little more than just a trinket. Our experts who analyzed the remnants of this missile found a gyroscope of the very same type with which Yuri Gagarin flew into space over 60 years ago. Mr. President, Russia portrays itself and this brutality against Ukraine as a display of power, attempting to threaten international community. Russia wants to sell to this Council and the whole UN family the impression that it is invincible, but this is another illusion. The carefully staged image of strength is nothing but a smoke and mirrors, completely detached from reality. The Russian leadership is like a game player holding the worst possible hand, yet Putin keeps a perfect poker face pretending that he has an ace up his sleeve. In reality, Russia's cards are extremely weak. Russia's position is getting more fragile every day, and its bluff is evident. The Kremlin used to puff off its cheeks and flex its muscle, but it is all just a fig leaf, hiding the weakness of the Russian war machine, which is inevitably approaching its critical point. What Russia tries to project as its strength is in fact nothing else but a manifestation of vulnerability, reflecting its failure to achieve strategic military goals on the battlefield. Distinguished members of the Council, let me present you just a few facts which will demonstrate that Russia is losing this war. It is not a question of if, it is just a question of when. Russia's economic and social foundations are under immense strain. Growth is fully dependent on defense procurement rather than genuine economic productivity. 2025 was a breaking point of Russia's economy, which saw a dramatic shift from short-term wartime growth to long-term economic stagnation. Initially, following the invasion, Russia benefited from high global commodity prices and a spending-fueled boom, but these factors have now disappeared. The combination of weak growth, rising taxes, and reduced revenues points toward a deteriorating economic ability to further finance this war. With reserves depleting and structural damage accumulating, most experts agree that the Russian economy is and will remain at its weakest point since the turbulences of the late 1990s. 2025 showed that Russia's economic growth, driven by wartime spending, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Russia's military production temporarily propped up GDP in the first years after the large-scale invasion, but the economic boost from militarization has now completely faded. In late 2025, the GDP growth slowed to 0.1%. For 2026, the IMF forecasts a very weak growth of the Russian economy, projecting around 0.6% of GDP. It is expected to stagnate with persistently elevated inflation. That underscores the steep slowdown from Russia's 4.3% GDP growth back in 2024, which had been fueled by heavy wartime spending. Such structural stagnation is projected to persist well beyond 2026 due to today's war-driven pressures. Until 2025, growth rested on a sharp rise in state spending, which increased by roughly a quarter in 2024, but this driver disappeared last year, and there is no obvious catalyst to revive growth in 2026. Last year, for the first time since the pandemic, Russia collected less budget revenue than originally planned. When this budget was approved, revenues were set at around $500 billion, but updated forecasts suggest that they will come in closer to 447 billion US dollar. This marks a break from the previous 3 years, including 2024, when revenues consistently exceeded initial projections. This led the Kremlin to order higher tax collection to sustain war spending. Tax increases and revenue declines indicate that the war is largely financed by shrinking domestic economic activity rather than robust trade surpluses. Oil and gas. We spoke about this last time, a month ago. These two factors have historically funded between 30 and 40 and 50% of Russia's federal budget and a large share of war financing. But these revenues have fallen at least by a quarter last year. 2026 is likely to bring another year of weak budget incomes for Russia. The World Bank expects a global oil supply surplus to push Brent crude oil prices down from the average of $68 a barrel to around $60 a barrel this year, the lowest level in 5 years. The price of Russian Urals crude have also been trading below historical levels. Independent trackers reported prices even lower in early January this year, with Urals near $35 a barrel, the lowest in many years. Additional pressure on the Russian budget and energy sector is put by new sanctions imposed by the United States last October against its two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Moscow is forced to agree to ever larger discounts on oil, sometimes to more than $30 per barrel. Following the introduction of new US sanctions, Russia's oil and gas revenues in December 25 fell by almost 50% compared to a previous year. While the so-called shadow fleet has helped Russia accumulate up to $100 billion in annual revenue, it has not stopped export revenue declines overall. Increased seizing and sanctioning of such vessels and recent legal actions against them signal even greater constraints ahead. The United States and partners have sanctioned Russian tankers as part of measures targeting the primary source of war funding. As a result, shipments in the week to January 4th fell to 3 million barrels a day, the lowest since August. On the monetary side, the Russian central bank was forced to raise interest rates to a record high of over 20% to curb rapid inflation. This reduced corporate profits as businesses stopped investing. Production in some industries fell sharply and corporate debt rose rapidly. Economists point to the potential of a banking crisis by November 26, caused by the expansion of corporate lending in the first 3 years of the war. Russian bankers themselves sounded the alarm about the growth of problem loans, with some even stating that many companies are in a pre-default state. Russia's reserves and hence its ability to absorb economic shocks look large on paper but are strategically constrained and fragile. As of late 2025, the central bank reports $720 billion in international reserves, yet a large part of them remains frozen in Western jurisdictions. Of the accessible portion, 40% accounts for gold, an asset illiquid under sanctions and difficult to monetize at scale. Russia's national wealth fund, the true fiscal buffer for deficits, has been heavily depleted from $145 billion pre-war to now $35 billion by mid-25. Ongoing budget deficits of roughly 3 to 4% of GDP, driven by military spending and weaker energy revenues, mean the fund is being drawn down to plug gaps rather than invest, with credible projections that it could be largely exhausted in 2026 if conditions persist. Economic problems are severely affecting the purchasing power of Russia's population. A recent report by Russian Sberbank showed that consumers began tightening their belts and reduced their spending. Financial difficulties caused by the economic crisis have forced Russians to take out quick loans that they cannot repay. But this war has also created a true demographic shock for Russia. Just imagine this figure. Since Putin began his war in February 2022, there have been over 1.2 million Russian casualties, killed or wounded. Last year, Russia was losing on average 1,200 soldiers a day, or 50 soldiers an hour, or almost 1 soldier per minute. So during this emergency meeting of the Security Council, most probably around 100 Russian soldiers will have lost their lives. These losses have consequences for Russian economy as well. About 70% of its casualties are men aged from 20 to 39, the core male labor and fertility cohort. Simultaneously, around 900 most young educated Russians have immigrated since 22, removing precisely the workers with the highest productivity and tax contribution. As a result, Russia entered 2026 with an estimated labor shortage of 6.5 million workers, projected to widen to 11 million by 2030. This shrinks the tax base while raising pension, healthcare, and compensation costs, structurally degrading Russia's capacity to finance both a modern economy and a prolonged high-intensity war. These developments create a systematic economic effect which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to cover ongoing war costs without deepening economic pain at home. Sustaining such a protracted, resource-intensive conflict requires consistent, robust revenue streams, and current trends show that these streams are on the verge of collapse in 2026. So it is precisely this catastrophic state of Russia's economy that is driving Moscow to issue ultimatums and use Oreshniks and other ghosts to coerce the international community into accepting its terms for ending the war. It is Russia that finds itself in a zugzwang. Mr. President, let me reiterate, Ukraine will continue to seek peace, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, based on international law and grounded in the principles of the Charter. Ukraine remains fully committed to the peace process initiated by US President Donald Trump. We commend the mediation efforts of the United States and active diplomatic efforts of our European and other partners that seek to pave the way for genuine peace. Last weeks were marked by an intensive shuttle diplomacy in Florida, in Paris, with personal engagement of President Volodymyr Zelensky. What we see, though, is that Russia deliberately derailing these peaceful initiatives. To conclude, I would first of all appeal to our allies and partners who have been strongly helping Ukraine. All the available air defense systems and missiles in stockpiles must be transferred immediately to protect civilians and energy infrastructure from Russian bombs. We also need long-range weapons to neutralize future attacks. We call upon our allies to introduce additional sanctions and increase economic pressure on Russia, including tougher measures targeting the shadow fleet, further restrict energy revenues as well as Moscow's ability to acquire critical components for weapons production. We also wish to appeal to all those UN member states who have so far remained neutral and continue to claim that sanctions are unacceptable or useless. This is a wrong approach. They are highly effective despite their imperfect implementation. The medicine is working. It is the dose that should be increased. As long as Russia keeps abusing its veto power, blocking the Security Council, coordinated sanctions are the only way to push Moscow towards peace. Mr. President, Russia resembles the Soviet Union in its final years of decline, before it imploded. It is not an expanding superpower, but a rigid, overextended system burdened by unbearable military expenditures and internal decay. No one expected the USSR to crumble overnight, yet it happened. The historic parallels with present-day Russia are strikingly similar. Today's Russia is like a colossus with feet of clay, and it is only a matter of time before this entire house of cards collapses. So our message to Russia is very simple, and I will put it in Russian language, since you have claimed that this language is being prohibited or discriminated in Ukraine. Все, ребятушки, приплыли.
That's it, guys. We're here. Let's dry our oars.
Very soon, I think.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. The 10,087th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, and Mr. Ramesh Rasachingam, Director, Humanitarian Sector Division, Head and Representative of the Office for Coordination and Humanitarian Affairs in Geneva. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. The start of the new year has brought no peace or even respite to Ukraine, but renewed fighting and devastation. Large-scale aerial assaults by the Russian Federation against civilians and civilian infrastructure across the country have resulted in horrific levels of destruction and suffering. As temperatures plummet far below freezing, the Russian Federation has intensified its systematic attacks targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The strikes have killed and injured scores of civilians and deprived millions of Ukrainians of electricity, heating, and water for prolonged periods. The impact of these attacks is felt hardest by the most vulnerable, the elderly, children, and persons with limited mobility. They follow a well-established and deeply troubling pattern. Attacks escalate when weather conditions worsen and people's need for heating becomes most acute. In one of the most recent large-scale barrages overnight between 8 and 9 January, the Russian Federation reportedly launched 242 drones and 36 missiles against Ukraine. In Kiev, at least 4 people were reportedly killed and 25 others injured. A paramedic rushing to provide emergency medical care was among those killed, reportedly by a so-called double-tap strike. Energy facilities and multiple residential buildings were damaged, leaving nearly half of the city and hundreds of thousands of residents without heating. The embassy of Qatar was also damaged. That same day, areas in the western Lviv region near the Polish border were reportedly targeted by a Russian intermediate-range ballistic missile, the so-called Oreshnik. This would be the second time the potentially devastating weapon has been fired at Ukraine since 2024. The Oreshnik system is believed to be capable of carrying nuclear weapons, which has heightened concern over its deployment. According to Ukrainian authorities, the strike damaged gas distribution pipelines, raising additional concerns about risks to critical civilian infrastructure. Also on 8 January, 2 foreign-flagged civilian vessels were hit by Russian drones in the Odessa region. On 17 January, Russian strikes in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions reportedly left more than 1 million people without running water or heating. In Kryvyi Rih, 17 people, including children, were reportedly injured when missiles and drones hit residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure. And in the Odessa region, 2 people were reportedly killed and 8 others injured in an attack on 2 ports. Cooking oil storage facilities and containers were damaged. Odessa was hit again yesterday. This was the latest in a highly concerning escalation of strikes targeting Ukraine's port infrastructure and commercial shipping. In recent weeks, civilian casualties and extensive damage to critical infrastructure have also been reported in Kherson, Donetsk, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. In total, since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that at least 14,999 civilians have been killed, including 763 children, and 40,601 civilians injured, including 2,486 children. The actual figures are likely higher. OHCHR's monitoring mission in Ukraine has just reported that 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians since 2022. Mr. President, inside the Russian Federation, local authorities continue to report civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure resulting from alleged Ukrainian strikes. We are seeing additional reports of escalating cross-border attacks on Russia's oil and energy infrastructure, some of which reportedly resulted in civilian casualties and damage to civilian and residential facilities. In Belgorod Oblast, local authorities reported that 600,000 residents were left without electricity, heating, and water after Ukrainian strike on 9 January. The authorities also reported the use of drones targeting Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod regions on 10 January, which left 1 person killed and at least 3 other people injured. Due to lack of access and limited public information, the United Nations is not in a position to verify these reports. Mr. President, we reiterate the Secretary General's strong condemnation of all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Such attacks violate international humanitarian law. No matter where they occur, they are unacceptable, unjustifiable, and must stop immediately. Mr. President, as hostilities intensify, the situation at Ukraine's nuclear sites remains extremely precarious. On the night of 3 January, Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation, lost power from one of its high-voltage lines due to hostilities. Over the past week, the team of the International Atomic Energy Agency at the site has reported a significant increase in military activity in the areas surrounding the plant, including explosions heard close to the facility. These events are extremely alarming. The IAEA continues its efforts to establish temporary ceasefire zones in the areas around the plant to allow for essential repair work to ensure its safe and secure functioning. We urge both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to engage constructively with the IAEA and to immediately cease any military activities near the plant in order to reduce the risk of a catastrophic accident. Mr. President, in just over a month, we will mark 4 years since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war has brought untold suffering to the Ukrainian people, killed an unimaginable number of young men of both countries, caused global economic dislocation, and sown instability in the region and beyond. The damage it has done to the international system is still being measured. The war should never have started, and it must stop. We commend the efforts of the United States and all others concerned who are working towards peace. We urge all involved to sustain this vital work, including through concrete steps to de-escalate, stop the ongoing attacks impacting civilians in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and establish clear parameters to end this devastating conflict. We reaffirm the Secretary General's repeated calls for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire as a first step towards a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace grounded in respect for international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Any peace in Ukraine must fully uphold the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The United Nations remains ready to support all meaningful efforts toward this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. DiCarlo for the briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingam.
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to update the Council on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Since our last briefing on 9 December, the plight of civilians has grown more desperate as large-scale attacks continue to push energy systems, emergency services, and the very means of winter survival to the brink. As just outlined by Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, multiple regions across the country were struck on 8 January, causing civilian casualties and widespread disruption to electricity, heating, and water supplies with temperatures of minus 10 degrees Celsius and below. In Kiev, authorities reported several civilian deaths and more than 20 people injured in the attacks. Among the victims were health workers and first responders assisting those affected. One health worker was killed, while 5 rescuers and 4 health workers were injured after coming under repeated strikes. Since the start of the year, the World Health Organization has reported 11 attacks on healthcare in Ukraine, resulting in 2 deaths and 14 injuries. What makes these attacks especially devastating is that they cripple the systems that keep civilians alive during winter. Power, heating, and water infrastructure have been repeatedly struck in major urban areas, including Kiev, Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kryvyi Rih, leaving hundreds of thousands of people without electricity, heating, or water for prolonged periods. With winter conditions intensifying, each damaged substation, heating pipeline, or pumping station triggers cascading failures that put even more lives at risk. In Kryvyi Rih, families are melting snow for washing and cooking. They're also heating water over candles after power cuts lasting more than 1 day. In Kiev, more than 1,200 heated safe spaces are operating, and state emergency services and our humanitarian partners have established an additional 68 heating points in the most affected neighborhoods, offering people a place to warm up, charge their phones, and reconnect with loved ones and amid blackouts. Mr. President, civilians continue to be evacuated under dangerous conditions. Continued hostilities and repeated strikes on residential areas are forcing people to flee frontline communities. In recent days, evacuations have continued from the Donetsk region, including a high proportion of children, older people, and those with limited mobility. On arrival in safer areas, many have urgent needs for shelter, medical care, protection, and winter assistance. Our humanitarian partners continue to deliver whenever access allows. Emergency support, including shelter materials, winter assistance, and health services, is being provided in Kiev and other impacted cities and towns. However, humanitarian access remains constrained in some frontline areas due to active hostilities, damaged infrastructure, and security restrictions, delaying or suspending operations where needs are most acute. For civilians in occupied parts of Ukraine, humanitarian organizations have limited information about needs arising from ongoing fighting and winter conditions. The humanitarian community stands ready to support civilians in need wherever they are, including in the occupied areas of Ukraine, where we must have unimpeded humanitarian access and sustained funding. Mr. President, as the escalation of hostilities in Ukraine soon enters its fifth year, 10.8 million people in Ukraine urgently need humanitarian assistance. Tomorrow, that's Tuesday, the 13th of January, the United Nations and our partners, in consultation with the government of Ukraine, will launch the 2026 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, which seeks $2.31 billion to deliver life-saving assistance to 4.12 million people facing the most severe needs. Under the humanitarian reset, the response in Ukraine is sharply focused on those most at risk, particularly along the front line, including civilians affected by displacement and repeated strikes on essential infrastructure. Mr. President, we must reiterate that international humanitarian law is unequivocal. Civilians and civilian objects, wherever they are, must be protected, and constant care must be taken to spare them. Indiscriminate attacks, including those causing disproportionate incidental death or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, are strictly prohibited. Strikes on residential areas and energy systems raise serious concern about compliance with these fundamental rules of war. I urge members of this Council to act decisively. Use your voice, your influence, and your engagement to ensure these three things. First, that civilians everywhere are protected. Second, that safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need is facilitated. When support is delayed or suspended, the consequences are immediate and severe. Third, that humanitarian action is funded in line with the scale of needs through the hyper-prioritized Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, so that essential life-saving assistance can continue. Mr. President, civilians who are enduring these attacks and need more than statements of concern from this Council. They need that concrete action to reduce civilian harm and ensure that humanitarian support continues to reach people when they need it the most. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingam for the briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and I thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo and Director Rajasingam for their detailed and factual briefings. Almost 4 years ago, the Russian Federation started its full-scale aggression against Ukraine. This Council has held more than 100 meetings to stop it, but the Russian Federation continues to reject international community's appeals for peace. For this reason, Latvia, together with Liberia, Denmark, France, Greece, and the United Kingdom, supported Ukraine's request for this meeting. Worse, the Russian Federation increases its vile attacks, killing innocent children, mothers, teachers, as well as destroying infrastructure, and continues to endanger diplomatic missions in Kiev. Once again, the night of 8th to 9th January, the Russian Federation carried out large-scale combined drone and missile attacks on Ukraine. For a second time, it launched an intermediate-range ballistic missile, also capable of carrying nuclear payload. Latvia strongly condemns the continuous barbaric attacks by the Russian Federation, which deliberately target civilians and energy infrastructure in the midst of sub-zero winter. We call on the members of this Council to condemn this systematic brutality, which threatens peace and security globally. The Russian Federation is deliberately testing the limits of international resolve. Latvia will not relent in our support to the core principles of the UN Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Latvia will continue to support Ukraine and will act against the aggressor and its supporters, including through targeted sanctions. The Russian Federation relies on fiction and lies, including the unfounded claims of airstrikes on the residence of the President of the Russian Federation, as a pretext. It is deplorable but entirely predictable. A well-worn tactic from the Kremlin's playbook, designed to fabricate pretexts, stall for time, deliberately undermine any genuine peace effort. The only verified fact remains that the Russian Federation is killing civilians. And we call on the Russian Federation to stop spreading falsehoods and instead grant access to international monitors, especially UN agencies and the ICRC. And we continue to be deeply concerned by reports about human trafficking from Africa, the Middle East, and other regions to work in drone factories in the Russian Federation and even be sent to the front lines as expendables. Mr. President, Latvia strongly supports the efforts under the leadership of the United States to secure a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Ukraine has clearly demonstrated its readiness to make high sacrifices to achieve it, and the whole of Europe has worked tirelessly in good faith to restore peace in our continent. Last week in Paris, a coalition of over 35 nations, including Latvia, together with Ukraine and the United States, committed to durable principles to achieve peace in Ukraine. The Russian Federation rejects it. It is important to highlight a disturbing pattern. The closer we come to peace and justice, the more brazen the attacks and lies by the Russian Federation become. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reaffirm our resolute support to Ukraine. And let's be clear, for 4 years, the Russian Federation has been deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine. These inhumane and immoral tactics will not succeed. Ukraine heroically defends itself against aggression. And as an elected member of this Council, Latvia takes its responsibilities with the full weight of the moment, a clear sense of duty under the UN Charter, and is committed to achieving a just and lasting peace. And we urge all members of this Council to uphold their responsibility and recognise the actor obstructing peace and act accordingly. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liberia thanks the briefers for their important updates and thanks the United States and others for efforts aimed at achieving peace. Mr. President, the risks before us are clear. Continued escalation, deepening humanitarian suffering, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and broader regional instability. The war in Ukraine tests not only international peace and security, but the foundational principles of this organization. The principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. These principles are not abstract ideals, nor were they intended to be. They are the rules that make peaceful coexistence among nations possible. Furthermore, they guarantee the maintenance of international peace and security. Whenever the Council has confronted questions on these principles, it has acted to confirm one constant truth. Adherence to these principles is neither optional nor selective. Importantly also, they cannot be upheld in response to convenience. Notably, the erosion of these principles, whether through disregard or selective application, has repeatedly made the world more dangerous and unsafe. This was true 80 years ago. It certainly remains true today. Mr. President, a world committed to multilateralism must reject the notion that force is an effective or legitimate language of security. The very basis of our collective membership in the United Nations is a shared commitment to resolve disputes through dialogue and peaceful means. Therefore, Liberia calls on all parties to respect their obligations under the Charter, obligations to protect civilians, to halt destruction, to take concrete steps toward ending this war, and to prevent further escalation. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Our own lived experience reminds us that military solutions, even when deemed to be possible, do not deliver sustainable peace nor lasting security. Mr. President, Liberia supports this Council's continued engagement on the war in Ukraine. However, we must be clear. When the Council declares itself seized of a matter that gravely threatens international peace and security, it must do so with the collective resolve to move beyond a mere repetition of national positions to a genuine search for a resolution. Anything less risks undermining the credibility of this Council and of the United Nations itself. After years of conflict and repeated warnings of worsening conditions, this Council simply cannot be content with restating positions that have neither advanced peace nor offered hope to those affected. The people of Ukraine and all those impacted by this war deserve peace and they deserve security. That outcome is not impossible. It is, in fact, achievable, but only if we act with seriousness, creativity, urgency, and cooperation. Liberia's own journey from conflict to peace has taught us this hard truth. Peace becomes possible when cooperation replaces confrontation, when dialogue includes even adversaries, and when international law and fidelity to the Charter bind all nations, both big and small. Finally, Mr. President, ours is a simple message. The war must end. The killings must stop. The destruction must cease. The path to true peace must begin. Liberia stands ready to work constructively with all Council members to ensure that future generations inherit a world where peace remains possible. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo and OCHA Director Raja Singham for their briefings. We also welcome the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. Mr. President, while talks to bring peace to Ukraine continue, Russia has again chosen to intensify its brutal war, which brings us again to this Council. It is hard to know which element of Russia's attacks on Ukraine last week, on the night between 8th and 9th of January, is the most outrageous. Firstly, in a single night, Russia fired hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine's cities. Before dawn, at least 4 civilians in Kyiv were dead and 25 wounded. And as we've heard from Undersecretary General DiCarlo, paramedics attempting to pull survivors from the rubble were also attacked, a so-called double-tap strike, with one of the rescuers also killed. Denmark condemns these shocking Russian attacks. We recall that intentionally directing attacks against civilians is a serious violation of international humanitarian law and constitutes a war crime. Secondly,
Russian missiles struck key sites in Ukraine's energy grid, leaving half of Kyiv's home without heating. This is part of the Kremlin's ongoing efforts to use the harsh winter as a weapon of war and deny Ukraine's civilian population the warmth they need to survive in freezing temperatures. We recall that attacking objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Denmark calls on Russia to immediately comply with all of its HIL obligations. Thirdly, the airstrikes included the deployment of a hypersonic missile which hits the outskirts of Lviv, hitting a city not only a short distance from NATO and EU territory, is a reminder of Russia's recklessness and causes for great concern. Russia's use of this missile has again shown its willingness to escalate its war of aggression. These are irresponsible actions which we condemn and which only reinforce our commitment to continue supporting Ukraine alongside our allies and partners. Mr. President, the Russian aerial blitz on Ukraine is the latest appalling episode in the Kremlin's ongoing and systematic acts of aggression. As we've repeatedly said, it is far beyond high time for Russia's war in Ukraine to stop. Despite intense engagement between Kyiv and Washington, so far we have only seen bad faith participation by Moscow in peace talks. Russia's response to diplomacy has been to inflict more death and destruction to the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, it is clear that the first step must be an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. This is exactly what Ukraine has been offering for almost a year now. In the absence of President Putin showing a sudden and dramatic change of heart, the international community must apply more pressure and do all it can to compel Russia to seriously walk the path to peace. Let me be clear. It was Russia's crime of aggression that was the only root cause of this horrendous war. We cannot turn our backs on the core principles and rules under the UN Charter. The prohibition of the use of force, the right to self-defense, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of international disputes. These are key not only to ensuring Ukraine's long-term security, but for all UN member states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席
President, I thank Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Director Rajasingham for their briefings. The Ukraine crisis has dragged on for almost 4 years. The situation has now entered a critical stage of negotiated settlement. The key stakeholders have proposed various peace initiatives and plans. The window for negotiations has opened, and the dawn for peace is within sight. Regrettably, fighting continues on the ground, and repeated flare-ups have cast a shadow over the prospect of peace. The path forward remains arduous. The more complex and grim the situation, the more we must not give up hope, and the more we must redouble our efforts. First, peace must prevail over war. Russia and Ukraine are inseparable neighbors. Achieving harmonious coexistence between the two countries is the common aspiration of all parties and the only correct choice. Continued war will only lead to the loss of more innocent lives and heightened tensions at the regional and international levels. We call on all relevant parties to abide by the 3 principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no provocation by any party in order to de-escalate the situation, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, create conditions for political settlement, and strive for the early realization of peace. Second, dialogue must prevail over confrontation. Conflicts and tensions, regardless of their scale and intensity, will ultimately need to be resolved through dialogue and negotiation. The hard-won momentum of the latest round of peace talks should be cherished by all sides. We call on the parties to the conflict to work toward the same goal, continuously build consensus, and take seriously and appropriately address each other's security concerns in order to reach a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement as soon as possible. The potential peace deal should eliminate the root causes of conflict, build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture, and contribute to the lasting peace and stability in the continent. Third, unity must prevail over division. Garnering more voices and making stronger appeals are essential for promoting a ceasefire and giving lasting peace a better chance. The international community should project a more objective, balanced, and rational voice to help realize the vision of peace as soon as possible. The continued spillover of the crisis has severely impinged on the global economy. China opposes the use of the crisis by any party as a pretext to impose illegal unilateral sanctions and disrupt normal trade and economic relations. China also opposes any opportunist attempts to divide the world and create closed and exclusive blocs. President, China's position on the question of Ukraine has been crystal clear and consistent, guided by President Xi Jinping's four shoulds. China has been unrelenting in promoting peace talks, facilitating a political settlement, and creating conditions and building consensus for peace. We have maintained close communication with Russia, Ukraine, and other relevant parties, actively engaged in shuttle diplomacy, and set up a Friends of Peace group for this purpose. We have been continuously making calls for peace, garnering consensus, and promoting peace efforts. China sincerely welcomes all efforts that contribute to the peaceful settlement of the crisis and will continue to work with others to play a constructive role in promoting a political solution of the crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo and Director Justifies Oreshnik for their briefings, and I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in the meeting. Mr. President, the continuing drone and missile attacks unleashed by the Russian Federation against major urban centers, civilians, and critical energy infrastructure in Ukraine, including over the holiday season and the past few days, demonstrate Moscow's disregard for the diplomatic momentum built in Geneva, Florida, and Paris. The intermediate-range ballistic missile strike on January 9 against the Lviv region, just 60 kilometers from the Polish border, using the so-called Oreshnik missile, represents the most recent serious escalation of this war, posing a major threat to the safety and energy security of Ukraine. These recent strikes that resulted in numerous civilian casualties and severe destruction of buildings and critical infrastructure left thousands of Ukrainians without electricity, heating, and water in the middle of winter, illustrating once again utter disregard for international law and international humanitarian law. Moreover, during the strikes in Kiev, the premises of the Embassy of the State of Qatar were damaged in flagrant violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. In view of the above, I would like to make 3 points. First, we join the Secretary General in condemning in the strongest possible terms the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian energy infrastructure, in blatant violation of international humanitarian law, and we call upon Russia to cease immediately such unacceptable, unjustifiable, and unlawful acts. As we have heard from USG Di Carlo, 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians in Ukraine since 2022. Total civilian casualties in Ukraine increased by more than 30% compared to the previous year and by 70% compared to 2023. We express our gratitude to all UN and humanitarian agencies in Ukraine, including OCHA, UNICEF, and FAO, for the life-saving services they provide. particularly in protecting the most vulnerable groups such as children, women, and people with disabilities. Second, we reiterate our principled position that the protection of humanitarian personnel should always remain a top priority and that they must never be targeted. We are also deeply concerned by the ongoing impact of hostilities on healthcare infrastructure and personnel. According to the World Health Organization, nearly 43% of all attacks against healthcare facilities globally in 2025 occurred in Ukraine. Tragically, 9 such attacks have already been documented in the country during the first days of 2026. We deplore the fact that during the recent strikes, 1 health worker was killed and several other health workers and rescuers were injured. Third, on peace efforts, Greece welcomes the progress on the draft peace plan achieved in Geneva and Florida, as well as the recent Paris Declaration. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire as necessary first step towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. We remain committed to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and we unequivocally reject any change of borders as a result of the use of force. This would set a dangerous precedent with potential repercussions on global security. We emphasize that no peace agreement can be sustainable without the direct involvement of Ukraine and Europe and the full consent of Ukraine. And we also stress the need for credible and enforceable security guarantees to prevent the recurrence of war. Last but not least, we should ensure that the post-war period enables for the reconstructions of Ukraine and sets the course for the return not only of peace but also of prosperity to the war-torn country. Mr. President, in closing, Greece reiterates its solidarity with the Ukrainian people as they persevere through the 5th harsh winter of hostilities in Russia's continuing war of aggression against Ukraine. We support the US-led initiatives to end the war, and we call on Russia to engage in the negotiations in good faith, in full conformity with international law and the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Roger Singham for briefing us today, and I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine in our meeting. At the end of last week, Russia launched yet another brutal assault on Ukraine. Ukraine has confirmed that on the night of 8 January, Russia launched 242 drones and 36 missiles, including an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile, against targets across Ukraine, in particular, critical energy infrastructure. As we've heard today, the attack caused the death and injury of dozens of civilians, the deprivation of millions of power and heating at a time when temperatures fell as low as -20 degrees Celsius, and additional pressure on vital services, including healthcare and water supplies. Russia's use of another Oreshnik IRBM should be universally condemned. This hypersonic missile, capable of traveling at over Mach 10, is reported to have hit a site in the region of Lviv, just 50 miles from the Polish border. Such action is reckless. It threatens regional and international security and carries significant risk of escalation and miscalculation. Russia has attempted to justify this escalation by claiming an attack on one of President Putin's residences. But this claim is false. There was no such attack. This is just another case of Russia's use of disinformation to justify egregious and escalatory activity in Ukraine. Russia's latest assault came in the same week that President Zelensky and the US were in Paris with European and international leaders to discuss peace. President Putin claims to want peace, and yet his actions tell a different story. The rest of the world wants peace in Ukraine, a peace in line with the UN Charter. We welcome the significant progress which has been made. Together with our international partners, the UK will continue to work hard towards that goal. President, Russia's attacks are clearly intended to erode the morale of the Ukrainian people. But their resilience and determination over the past 4 years remains undimmed. Energy services are already being restored, damaged homes being rebuilt. Ukraine will survive this latest attack as it survived so many before. And if President Putin thinks this violence will deter Ukraine's partners, he's wrong about that too. We will continue to ensure that Ukraine gets the military and financial support it needs to defend itself. And we will increase pressure on Russia to de-escalate and engage in meaningful negotiations. For the sake of international security and the integrity of the UN Charter, Ukraine must emerge from this war as a sovereign, secure, and independent country. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President, and a special thank you to our two briefers today, and also a special welcome to Ukraine at this meeting. Just days ago, U.S. diplomats met with EU and Ukrainian counterparts to advance negotiations toward a lasting peace. Thanks to the leadership of President Trump, we are closer to a deal now than at any point since the war began. Despite this, Russia launched more attacks on Ukraine, including its launch of its nuclear-capable Oreshnik ballistic missile, targeting an area of Ukraine close to the border with Poland and NATO. This constitutes another dangerous and inexplicable escalation of this war, even as the United States is urgently working with Kyiv, other partners, and Moscow to end the war through a negotiated settlement. At a moment of tremendous potential, due only to President Trump's unparalleled commitment to peace around the world, both sides should be seeking ways to de-escalate. Yet Russia's action risks expanding and intensifying the war. From the start, President Trump has decried the carnage of this conflict. Horribly, we have to continue to deplore the staggering number of casualties, service members and civilians, men, women, and children. We condemn Russia's continuing and intensifying attacks on Ukraine's energy facilities and other civilian infrastructure. These attacks make a mockery of the cause of peace, a cause of paramount importance to the world and to President Trump. I would like to remind the Russian Federation of its vote in favor of Security Council Resolution 2774 nearly 1 year ago. That resolution called for a swift end to the conflict and lasting peace. It would be nice if Russia matched their words with deeds. In the spirit of that resolution, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe must pursue peace seriously and bring this nightmare to an end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Excellencies, distinguished council members. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is taking the floor for the very first time in its national capacity ever since we became a member of the Security Council. At the outset, we would like to extend our heartfelt congratulations to the Republic of Somalia, which is presiding over the Security Council in the month of January. my country would also like to congratulate Bahrain, Colombia, Latvia, and Liberia on their accession to the Security Council. We welcome the interventions by USG for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as that of the OCHA Director. Your briefings gave the Council an updated snapshot of developments in Ukraine. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would also like to welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Ukraine at this meeting. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo remains deeply disquieted by the ongoing deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The continuation of this conflict does nothing but exacerbate the suffering of civilians, and with each passing day dims the prospects for lasting peace. The escalation we've seen over the last week is a sharp reminder of the pressing need, which has been highlighted by this Council countless times, the pressing need to opt for conflict resolution via peaceful means, in particular diplomacy and dialogue, in accordance with the principles of international law, international humanitarian law, and relevant provisions of the United Nations Charter. Thus, my country calls on all parties to meticulously uphold the obligations incumbent upon them under international law. We recall that civilians, much like essential and critical civilian infrastructure, must be protected and safeguarded under all circumstances. The Democratic Republic of the Congo also urges the parties to guarantee safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access so as to allow humanitarian actors to deliver effective assistance to civilians hard hit by this conflict. President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo stands convinced that there cannot be a lasting military solution to this protracted conflict, a conflict which today is at a clear impasse, of which the principal corollary is the heavy price paid day in, day out by civilians. From this vantage point, my country would like to welcome the diplomatic and mediation efforts deployed by international partners. In particular, the meetings initiated in December by the United States, aiming at promoting dialogue as well as creating the conditions for a progressive de-escalation of tensions. Peace, security, and the dignity of people taken hostage by this conflict are a priority for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For this reason, we reiterate our readiness to support all credible initiatives aimed at ensuring a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, so as to reduce human suffering and prevent any regionalization or extension of the crisis. Therefore, we encourage all parties to exercise restraint and to strive towards de-escalation, so as to create conditions which are conducive both to a resumption and a continuation of diplomatic exchanges and constructive negotiations, so as to be able to tackle the root causes of this conflict. And this with full respect for international law and the United Nations Charter. By way of conclusion, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reiterates its support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at crafting a negotiated solution which would sustainably reestablish peace, security, and stability for the benefit of people in Ukraine and throughout the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank the USG DiCarlo, USG for humanitarian, for political affairs and peace building. I would also like to thank Director Raja Singham from OCHA for their insightful briefings on the topic of our session today. the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its regret for the continuation of this war for the fourth year. Military operations still continue while civilians still shoulder the biggest burden of this war, and civilian infrastructure is damaged, which undermines the possibility to provide basic and essential services while humanitarian needs rise. We reiterate the importance of avoiding any acts that could adversely affect infrastructure and civilian facilities, embassies, diplomatic missions, and headquarters of international organizations, civil organizations based on international customs and norms. We regret the damage that was made to the Embassy of Qatar in Kyiv. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain is firmly convinced that ending the war in Ukraine lies in continuing dialogue and negotiations, and to hold on firmly to the principles of international law and international humanitarian law and the Charter of United Nations, and that all conflicts must be resolved peacefully in order to reach political resolution for them. We reiterate that it is necessary to keep dialogue and communication channels open and to work on coordination and consultation between all concerned parties to promote trust and to limit hostilities and their worsening in order to work on efforts towards peace. We also call for doubling efforts to have a negotiations path that would deal with the root causes of the conflict and would work on the security concerns of all parties in order to ensure the sustainability of this solution. We appreciate the diplomatic efforts of the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Qatar, which included efforts for mediation and humanitarian response, including exchange of prisoners and providing relief assistance and the exchange of detainees in order to alleviate humanitarian suffering and to prevent the expansion of this war. We reiterate the importance of reaching a positive development in the negotiations led by President Donald Trump, as this is a essential diplomatic initiative to reach a permanent ceasefire and achieve stability in Europe. In conclusion, we reiterate our support for regional and international efforts aimed at finding a comprehensive and lasting solution for the crisis in line with the principles of international law and the Charter of United Nations and UN Resolution 2774 in a way that would promote security and stability and peace regionally and internationally. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, representative of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We thank them both for the valuable information provided with regard to the situation on the ground. We also take note of the participation of the European delegations in this emergency meeting. The conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine is a war that is now approaching its fourth year without there being any possible clear end in sight. According to figures verified by the United Nations system, in Ukraine, at least 14,533 civilians have been killed since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. And according to figures reported by the authorities of the Russian Federation, 7,269 civilians are reported to have lost their lives during the same period. These figures, however, do not reflect the high level of military victims on both sides. Together, these figures do describe a profoundly alarming human tragedy that continues to be of great concern to the international community. It has become a spiral, an endless spiral of violence, of suffering. Since the conflict began almost 4 years ago, the Security Council has met multiple times, including 76 formal meetings to address the situation. And still, in the absence of sufficient political will, it has not been possible to put an end to this human suffering. Today, this Council has been convened once again to examine the same matter. And in the context of the recent counterattacks in Ukraine, we've seen the use not only of drones and hypersonic missiles, but also this time a high-speed, high-capacity hypersonic missile. These attacks have not only led to the deaths of more civilian lives and caused serious damage to critical civilian infrastructure, but unexcusably, they have also struck the diplomatic headquarters of the state of Qatar, resulting in damage. Panama, once again, urgently calls for restraint, for respect of the civilian population and the search for a peaceful solution in accordance with the United Nations Charter. In this regard, we are closely following the diplomatic efforts led very recently by Italy and France, as well and above all the important steps taken by the United States. All of these efforts aimed at bringing the parties closer together in order to achieve agreements for a political solution that will fully take into account respect for the principles of the UN Charter and international law. These efforts perhaps offer us a glimmer of hope, even though it's fragile, but they may point the path toward a cessation of hostilities and the protection of civilians, making it possible to achieve a solution, laying the foundations for a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this emergency session, and I also would like to extend my thanks to the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs of the United Nations, as well as to the Director and Representative of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I thank them both for their comprehensive reports, which once again reveal the severity of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, with an increasingly devastating human toll. Colombia expresses its absolute rejection of the use of force and of threats of the use of force, as these are actions that undermine the territorial integrity and political independence of any country. These acts constitute a direct violation of the fundamental purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, as well as of international law. Likewise, Colombia deeply regrets the reports provided by various humanitarian agencies referring to grave impacts on the civilian population, including fatalities. In this regard, my country expresses its solidarity with civilian victims, including humanitarian personnel and their families. We're also concerned by the damage to and attacks on critical infrastructure for the civilian population. These incidents must be strongly condemned and must cease immediately. Colombia will always reject any activity that endangers civilians and humanitarian staff, including medical personnel who work tirelessly and risk their lives to provide relief to affected persons. Respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances and without exception is an obligation of the parties, and it is not a negotiable matter. Mr. President, Colombia also reiterates its concern regarding the impact of hostilities on women, children, older persons, and entire families who are surviving under the extreme conditions of winter. This underscores the urgency of ensuring safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as respect for infrastructure and critical goods that are necessary to sustain the civilian population. It is urgent to adopt concrete measures that lead to de-escalation and to keeping channels of dialogue open and functional between the parties in order to advance towards a negotiated, peaceful and comprehensive solution that guarantees a just, sustainable and lasting peace. Mr. President, Excellencies, this Council cannot remain indifferent to the daily loss of human lives. Colombia urges the parties to refrain from intensifying hostilities, as they only hinder ongoing diplomatic efforts, erode the minimum trust needed to make progress on agreements, and reduce the prospects for a peaceful solution. In conclusion, the protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law and the establishment of an immediate and complete ceasefire continue to remain priorities. For this reason, and being mindful of the challenges involved in the pursuit of peace, Colombia calls upon the parties to choose a negotiated solution with goodwill and good faith, prioritizing dialogue and the principles of the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Madame Rosemary DiCarlo, as well as the Director of OCHA in Geneva, Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, for their briefings. The situation is unambiguous that is described. On the one hand, Ukraine, which has been attacked by Russia, continues to demonstrate its willingness for peace, to put an end to the war, particularly within the framework of the efforts led by the United States and Europe. It has done this systematically during the high-level meetings held in the United States and in Europe over the past weeks. On the other hand, Russia is once again choosing to escalate the violence and target the Ukrainian civilian population. And we once again express our full solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, a few days ago, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did not hesitate to state that, and I quote, Europeans constituted the main obstacle to peace. But when Russia boasts of firing a nuclear-capable ballistic missile at Lviv, 50 kilometers from the Polish border, which state truly constitutes an obstacle to peace? Especially since Russia claimed to be acting in response to an alleged Ukrainian attack on a Russian presidential residence, an alleged attack that we all know is a crude Russian staging aimed at undermining the peace process at a time when it's up to Russia to respond to a carefully prepared proposal by the American mediators. When Russia deliberately bombs the electricity, heating and running water networks of major Ukrainian cities in disregard of the Geneva Conventions, which state truly constitutes an obstacle to peace? These strikes are causing a dramatic humanitarian situation for hundreds of thousands of civilians facing freezing temperatures. When strikes hit the embassy of Qatar in Ukraine in violation of the Vienna Convention, and when Russian drones attack grain vessels in Odessa, jeopardizing global food security, which state truly constitutes an obstacle to peace? It is Russia which almost 4 years ago launched a war of aggression against a sovereign state in violation of the United Nations Charter. It is Russia which every day chooses to continue this aggression, even though it could stop it at any moment without harming its own security. Russia's grotesque attempts to reverse this reality cannot deceive the members of this Council nor the entire international community. Mr. President, together with its European partners, France will continue over the long term to support Ukraine in exercising its right to legitimate self-defense in the face of the aggression it is suffering, and to support its sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. The robust decisions taken at the European Council on the 18th of December bear witness to this for anyone who might doubt our determination. We're also preparing the terms of a just and lasting peace. This was precisely the purpose of the Paris summit of the 6th of January, which brought together 35 member states of the Coalition of the Willing, Ukraine and the United States, in order to commit ourselves to a system of security guarantees for Ukraine as soon as a ceasefire enters into force. Any settlement must indeed be supported by solid security guarantees for Ukraine in order to prevent any new Russian aggression. Mr. President, together with the Secretary-General of the United Nations, with the vast majority of the international community, and with Ukraine, France reiterates its call for a complete, immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as the Russian war of aggression has now lasted almost 4 years. We call upon Russia to listen to these voices from across the globe, to cease its aggression and to choose genuine dialogue over delaying tactics. France will continue to work tirelessly alongside all its partners in favor of a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
President, I would like to join colleagues in thanking Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Mr. Rajasingam for their briefings. Next month will mark 4 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The international community has been deeply perturbed by the continuing relentless hostilities, leaving behind a trail of death, destruction, economic losses, and immense humanitarian suffering, as we have also heard in today's briefings. We are alarmed by the recent intensification in fighting, with escalation in attacks from both sides, further worsening the already dire humanitarian situation. And such actions not only perpetuate the conflict, they undermine trust and the ongoing efforts for peace. Protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation and the foundation of the principles of international humanitarian law, which must be upheld fully by all sides. The reported damage to the Embassy of Qatar in Kiev is regrettable. Protection of diplomatic missions and the safety of its personnel is an obligation under international law. President, from the outset, Pakistan's position has been anchored in an unwavering conviction, the supremacy of dialogue as the only viable path for lasting peace. Now, more than ever before, the overwhelming global opinion is on the side of ending this conflict through peaceful means. This can only be achieved through a sustained, meaningful, and structured dialogue. Diplomacy and genuine engagement we have seen have delivered in the past. In the case of Black Sea Grain Initiative in July of 2022, and earlier in Istanbul, the two sides were seemingly very close to an agreement within weeks of the start of the conflict. The Security Council Resolution 2774 of last February was another opportunity that should have been seized in earnest by all sides for a swift end to the conflict. And Resolution 2788, adopted in July, further reinforced the imperative of peaceful settlement of disputes. Fortunately, the window for peace is still there. We commend efforts by many countries, particularly the United States, for the resolution of this conflict, giving primacy to dialogue. We hope that all sides will make full use of the ongoing diplomacy, demonstrate genuine political will, and engage constructively to make meaningful strides towards a peaceful, negotiated settlement of the conflict, starting with an immediate ceasefire. We hope that these efforts would lead to a just and lasting settlement in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant multilateral agreements acceptable to all sides, that corresponds to the security interests of both Ukraine and Russia and ensures peace and stability in Europe. The imperative to deliver millions from agony must remain paramount. For this, the path forward should be guided by sagacity, mutual understanding, and collective concern for humanity. Pakistan supports all efforts aimed at resolving the issue peacefully in a comprehensive and durable manner. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting promptly in response to yet another escalatory action by the Russian aggressor. I also wish to thank the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and the Director Raja Singham for their valuable briefings. As we all heard, last Friday we witnessed brutal attacks on Ukrainian residential areas and critical infrastructure. The city of Lviv, not far away from the border of my country, Poland, was targeted by Russian intermediate-range ballistic missile called Oreshnik. The systematic nature of Russian attacks demonstrates a deliberate strategy to inflict suffering of the civilian population by targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure and leaving millions of people without electricity and heating in the bitter winter conditions. Poland expresses its full solidarity with Ukraine and the families of the victims. We call on Russia to stop the war immediately. Mr. President, these attacks are being accompanied by a characteristic Russian fog of disinformation. Russian propaganda also today keeps on attempting to justify the strike by claiming it was carried out in response to alleged drone attack on Putin's residence, an incident that we all know has never took place. Mr. President, Russia's deadly strike and disinformation come at the time of intensified US-led diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the war. This conduct is unacceptable, harmful, and deserves the strongest condemnation from the international community. In this context, let me underline 3 points. First, Russia is not interested in achieving peace. And it's clear, the Kremlin and Putin's goals remain unchanged regardless of the peace efforts of the international community, the destruction of Ukraine and its complete capitulation. Russia also seeks to achieve this by discouraging continued international assistance to Ukraine. Under these circumstances, we cannot afford to reduce our support. On the contrary, it is essential to continue providing Ukraine with both military and non-military assistance to strengthen its position in the peace negotiations and to make clear that Russia's ultimate goals cannot be achieved. Therefore, let me underline that those countries that continue to support Russia in any form are directly or indirectly fueling this war. Against the backdrop, sanctions imposed by the European Union, the United States and the partners are exerting significant pressure on Russia's war economy, as we just heard. Poland supports the adoption of additional restrictive measures. We urge all countries that continue to import Russian oil to cease doing so, and this will contribute to ending the aggression. We also welcome the decisive stance in enforcing sanctions against Russia's illegal trading practices and its use of the so-called shadow fleet. Second, Russia's aggressive stance is responsible for the unprecedented arms buildup in Europe, and this compels countries like Poland to increase defense spending in order to protect their citizens and sovereignty. We would much prefer to allocate these resources to sustainable development and international cooperation. However, Russia leaves us of no choice and continues to divert the world away from the objectives that should unite us all. Third, in addition to the regular threats, Russia is intensifying hybrid attacks across the region and against NATO member states. We call on the Security Council to take this hybrid warfare seriously and to send a clear signal that this dangerous trend cannot be tolerated and must be stopped. That we call the Security Council to prevent any potential regional spillover. Mr. President, Poland will continue its goodwill participation in the peace efforts. At the same time, we will further extend necessary support to Ukraine. We encourage all partners to do the same, for the sake of just and lasting peace and for the future of the international community. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. Once again, for the fourth consecutive new year, we are forced to begin the year by condemning Russia's brutality, its violations of international law, including the UN Charter, and its rejection of multiple calls for peace by the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, and the International Court of Justice. Regrettably, even amid the colossal efforts by Ukraine, the United States, and Europe to achieve a just and lasting peace, we're meeting here today because Russia is, contrary to all these international efforts, escalating its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine in an attempt to disrupt the peace process. Russia used the intermediate-range ballistic missile, so-called Oreshnik, against Lviv, in close proximity to the EU and NATO borders, and launched over 200 drones and missiles against the capital Kiev and other cities overnight of the 9th of January, deliberately targeting energy facilities and civilian infrastructure in a bitter cold, and even the diplomatic missions. This is yet another escalation by Russia. The use of a nuclear-capable ballistic missile sets a dangerous precedent that not only threatens the security of Ukraine and Europe, but also undermines global peace and security. The use of such systems increases the risk of escalation and miscalculation. Moreover, Russia's ongoing missile and drone attacks pose grave risks to nuclear safety in Europe. The protective shield over Chernobyl's nuclear reactor has already lost its primary safety functions, as verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency after Russia's attack last year. Mr. President, supported by Belarus, the DPRK and Iran, but also fueled by shadow fleet tankers' illegal oil trade, and the supply of dual-use technologies, Russia is expanding its aggression, including by engaging in hybrid actions across Europe and elsewhere. The Baltic states, as countries neighboring Russia, that still have vivid memory of what living under Russia's occupation is about, have been providing multifaceted support to the government and people of Ukraine. Reiterate our call on the international community to discontinue all assistance to Russia that enables its aggression. The Baltic states strongly condemn Russia's deliberate attacks on civilian population in Ukraine. We urge Russia to respect its commitments under international humanitarian law and to protect civilians and humanitarian personnel in all circumstances. We reaffirm our full support to Ukraine in standing up to Russia's terror and call on all to increase pressure on Russia to force it to the negotiating table. In line with the UN General Assembly resolution on the return of Ukrainian children as adopted at the 11th Emergency Special Session on the 3rd of December last year, concrete action must now be taken to protect the rights, safety, and well-being of the children of Ukraine, especially those forcibly deported to and illegally adopted in Russia and Belarus, to ensure their safe return and the accountability of perpetrators. We demand full accountability, including implementation of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants issued on the 17th of March of 2023 against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over allegations of involvement in the war crimes of child abduction during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Mr. President, Russia must heed the call for peace by President Trump and the international community, and immediately sees its illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression. The Baltic states reaffirm our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. As this Council continues to overwhelmingly call for peace in Ukraine, and while sustained diplomatic efforts by the United States, Ukraine, and Europe intensified lately, Russia has yet again to show a genuine will to stop its illegal and unprovoked war of aggression. In the last days, new innocent lives were lost, as deliberate targeting with missiles and drones of Ukrainian civilians and civilian areas continued in violation of international humanitarian law. Millions of Ukrainians were deprived of essential services, including electricity, heating, and water, in the midst of a harsh cold spell as a result of weaponization of winter. Another foreign diplomatic mission in Kyiv sustained damage, once again demonstrating the reckless nature of these attacks and disregard for international law. Romania joins the UN Secretary General and other Council and UN member states in strongly condemning the continued Russian targeted attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including strikes in Kyiv and Lviv region, which are unacceptable under international law and must stop. We reiterate our solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and we remain determined in supporting Ukraine in ensuring accountability and justice for these brutal attacks. President, there is no justification to respond with escalation and terror against civilians while the whole world expects now Russia to match Ukraine's proven commitment and engagement in peace efforts. The use of an Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile against civilian infrastructure, as well as in close proximity with the borders of the European Union and NATO, was escalatory and constitutes a serious threat to regional international security and stability. And this is not what is expected from a responsible permanent member of the Security Council. Instead, it is high time to put an end to this senseless war of aggression. Intense diplomatic efforts by the United States, Ukraine, and the European Union in the last weeks brought progress in pursuing the goal of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. An immediate ceasefire, to which Ukraine already committed, remains a significant first step. And it remains imperative to keep up pressure to stop this war, including through sanctions and concerted action against Russia's shadow fleet. Security in the Black Sea remains of concern for us as well, as Russia stepped up attacks on ports in the Odessa region. Alongside its partners in the coalition of the willing, Romania remains engaged in ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States towards a just and lasting peace. Robust and workable security guarantees for Ukraine is the element that will define such a peace in face of an aggressor with a historical record of relapsing into breaches of international law. We informed extensively this Council about Romania's comprehensive efforts in supporting Ukraine and addressing the global consequences of Russia's aggression. And Romania will continue to bring its contributions to securing peace and reconstruction in Ukraine. We reiterate our continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The achievement of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace needs to be in line with the UN Charter and those principles. Peace must not reward the aggressor. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, President. And thank you to the Somali Presidency for convening this meeting. Thank you to the briefers for their updates. And also allow me to use this opportunity to warmly welcome the Council's new members. Colleagues, we meet as Russia continues to escalate its war of aggression against Ukraine in ever more brutal ways. In recent days, and while peace talks intensify, Russia has intensified its own attacks in Ukraine, cynically striking civilian energy, heating, and water infrastructure in the midst of winter, and deliberately targeting civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers. Last Thursday, Russia struck Ukraine with a reported 242 drones and 36 missiles. Among these, you've heard this many times in this room today, an Oreshnik hypersonic missile targeting Lviv, just 60 kilometers from the Polish border, where it hit residential buildings and energy infrastructure. The Qatari embassy was also damaged. And Russia has also significantly stepped up attacks on the city and port of Odessa, a crucial hub for global food security. This, colleagues, is unacceptable escalation and a further sign, if any were needed, that Russia has no interest in ending its war of aggression and stopping the killing. The European Union recalls that intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks, constitute violations of international humanitarian law and do amount to war crimes. And this, colleagues, this violence, this open aggression, this war has been going on and on and on for 4 years. As we approach the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, an illegal and unprovoked military action, all efforts should be geared towards achieving a just and lasting peace. Russia appears to believe that it can justify its actions and, at the same time, pretend to be committed to peace. It cannot. And as this were not enough, it complements this charade by continuing to spread false claims, including that Ukraine allegedly attacked a Putin residence, to distract attention from its years-long and escalating brutality. The reality, plain and simple for all to see, is that while Russia escalates, Ukraine is committed to peace. It has agreed to an immediate ceasefire already nearly a year ago, and continues every day to advocate for a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in line with the decisions by the General Assembly and the UN Charter. The reality is that peace talks have been intensifying and have made progress in spite of Russia's intransigence. The European Union will sustain these diplomatic efforts with Ukraine towards a just and lasting peace in accordance with international law, together with the United States and other partners. Chair, we urge Russia to agree to a full, unconditional and immediate ceasefire and call on all members of this Council to rally behind this objective and to push Moscow to engage in meaningful negotiations. The UNSC should exert maximum diplomatic pressure on the only country that openly violates Resolution 2774 to stop the killing. Third countries and actors and entities therein that continue enabling Russia's war of aggression must stop doing so. We condemn the continued military support provided by Iran, by Belarus, by the DPRK, and urge all countries, including all members of this Council, to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. Dear colleagues, for peace to be just and lasting, borders must not be changed by force. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere. Any future agreement must respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And it must guarantee Ukraine's long-term security and ability to defend itself. In this regard, the EU and member states are ready to contribute to robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine, notably through the coalition of the willing and in cooperation with the United States. This will include supporting Ukraine's ability to deter aggression and defend itself effectively. President, I close by reaffirming the European Union's continued and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. In coordination with our allies, we will continue to pursue an immediate ceasefire and a just and lasting peace, and to provide comprehensive political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and to its people. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.